Okay, now this an aesthetic education in an age or era of globalizations, it's actually the title of a forthcoming book, which is by now 10 years late. So I do hope that by the end of the calendar year, or perhaps the academic year, it will come out. It's the next thing. This is a project to sabotage Schiller's Letters on the Aesthetic Education of Man, in a series of letters, 1794-95, extremely important moment in the redefinition of empires in the history of Europe, as you know, because he saw that a revolution did not last in the absence of subjects trained in the practice of freedom. A revolution did not last in the absence of subjects trained in the practice of freedom. I define aesthetic very broadly. I have this habit of taking these words, I mean, we only have these words, imagination, aesthetic, etc., and giving them a kind of rule of thumb definition so that I'm not thinking about Baumgarten and Kant and all that stuff. I really mean by aesthetic education anything that trains the imagination for epistemological performance, training the imagination for the construction of things to know. When you know something, you construct it in a certain way. Training of the imagination for alternative epistemological performances. The imaginative social sciences are allied with the humanities here. We are accustomed to thinking of the teaching task of globalization to be welcoming and listening to international students, enhancing the already existing comparative edge of disciplines with more network and instant recall-oriented materials, focusing on broad issues such as secularism, world governance, extra-state collective economies, knowledge management, and acquiring pertinent vocabulary. Let us rather think of globalization in a different way. Market and data moving on networks outside of the constraints of historical nation states as a demand for a new way of thinking. It's not about travel and, as I say, Chinese opera today and Balinese cockfights tomorrow. No, it's a demand for a new way of thinking, not just new things to think about. Instant access to information has changed our way of thinking, only our ways of thinking. I'm not talking about doing the same old research, but hitting a button rather than browsing through libraries. I'm talking about ways of thinking, okay? The instant access to information has changed our way of thinking only in fields such as medicine, warfare, business, art. In the early days after the discovery of electricity, electricity was taken to be a prosthesis for the human nervous system. Truly amazingly amusing stuff. But my father, a village boy, very Horatio Alger type young man he was, 1899 he was born. He drank water from, street hydrants. He was a servant in a YMCA, etc. But he studied with Rutherford at Cambridge in the 20s, radiology, so he knew a little something about electricity, yes? And it was he who actually first told us these fabulous tales about what people thought electricity was, that it was directly, it's like uploading Temptation Seductions these days with very popular books about what computers can do. It's a bit like that, the electricity as a prosthesis for the human nervous system, somewhat as the digital is taken to be a prosthesis for the mechanism of knowing. We have to get a little used to this. It's not an immediate epistemological change or epistemic change that it brings in. The problem of knowledge is not what things to know, but how to know them, how to make them into things to know. Globalizations have introduced a kind of accessible contemporaneity to us and placed us within it, rendered obsolete the established ways of knowing the historical in a kind of teleological way. It's still around, but in fact it's obsolete. Modernity tradition methodologies, colonial, post-colonial methodologies are no longer useful to understand this new situation, which seems to lend itself more easily to a quantified, statisticalized, or simply arithmeticalized approach, which takes us into abstract generalizations, simulacra for democracy, crowd control, simulacra for democracy, going hand in hand with collections of curiosities produced by the enforced proximity of alien peoples. In the countries that I know best, tertiary and post-tertiary education in the humanities is typically thought of as preparation for jobs in the teaching professions. Not always, but generally. We need to acknowledge that humanities and imaginative social sciences also have a meta-vocational use other than or in addition to reproducing ourselves. Globalization, as I said before, takes place only in capital and data. You know, we all know this, and the 19th century philosopher Karl Marx said that capital wants to circulate mit Gedankenschnelle. Silicon chip actually brings that about. It's abstract. The data form is today the value form. It's not, money is not the general equivalent, it's data. So those are the two things that actually globalize. Everything else is damage control. It is in this area of damage control that the humanities and the imaginative social sciences have their meta-vocational task, other than just reproducing ourselves. Globalization cannot happen to the sensory equipment of the experiencing being, except insofar as it always was implicit in its outer limits. I don't have the time to discuss this slightly aphoristic sentence, but I can if in the Q&A if you want to ask me. And aesthetic education in our sense can continue to prepare us for the cultural task of globalization, thinking an uneven and only apparently accessible contemporaneity, I'm glossing now, that can no longer be interpreted, as I said a minute ago, by yesterday's polarities, such as modernity tradition, colonial, post-colonial. What is the nature of this aesthetic education? There can be no global formula for it. Most at home in institutions of tertiary education, give an idea in my book that can be called, as I said in my introduction, Sabotaging Schiller. And I believe we who are from, and India is kind of the jewel in the crown, especially my class, we who are sort of the beneficiaries, very peculiar beneficiaries of extraordinary colonial enterprises, we in fact have this task of not becoming silly culturalists, but I'm thinking about people like Lumumba, who had to be on Nkrumah, my generation luminaries who had to be killed by culturalists in hand, people from Katanga with their minerals, working with the CIA and the United Nations stepping back. That's not the kind of culturalism that we want to give today to the menagerie of, let's say, UNESCO-funded World Monument Funds, the Nara document, preservation of intangibles, etc. We don't want to belong there. The task is a little different, sabotaging Schiller. We continue to want the public sphere gains and private sphere constraints of the Enlightenment. Yet we must also find something relating to ourselves to counteract the fact that the Enlightenment came to colonizer and colonized alike through colonialism to support a destructive free trade, that it has always been a site of race, class, and gender struggle, and that top-down policy breaches of Enlightenment principles are more rule than exception. This is a matter of rearranging desires rather than filling needs from above. Why do I say this? Because I don't know all the universities in the world. You folks seem to be in a better situation than we are in the United States. But certainly my university, and I'm quite devoted to my university, it has decided to become a substitute for international civil society. giving clean water. I'm thinking of my colleague Jeffrey Sachs, giving clean water, HIV/AIDS support, and so on and so forth. I'm on many of these committees, and it seems, I say again and again, a university can't ace the United Nations. University is a place of learning. It's not a question of top-down doing good to folks in the world. And I have also a lot to say about it, but not time now. Democracy, I quote, cannot mean merely that an unskilled worker can become skilled, wrote Gramsci. It must mean, I continue to quote, it must mean that every citizen can govern, and that society places him, that's Gramsci, his time, society places him, even if only abstractly, in a general condition to achieve this. And if I went on with this one, I would also talk, of course, about Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois and Gramsci are quite, they didn't know about each other, but they are quite alike in thinking about this. This training for the habit of the ethical can only be worked at through attending to the systemic task of epistemological engagement. We learn how to teach from the historico-cultural text within which a certain group of students might be placed, so that they can escape just that historical situation and not remain narcissistically focused on it. The ethical is to acknowledge that to be human is to be angled toward others. It's a very different situation from just researching one's own background. Thus, Gramsci invokes, and I quote, the active relationship which exists between the intellectual and the cultural environment. The intellectual, is proposing to modify. The environment reacts back on the philosopher and imposes on him a continual process of self-criticism. The environment is, writes Gramsci, his teacher. For the relationship between master and disciple in the general sense, Gramsci is here into Hegel, in the general sense referred to, is only realized where this political condition exists, and only then do we get the historical realization of a new type of philosopher whom we, writes Gramsci, we could call a democratic philosopher, in the sense that he's a philosopher convinced that his personality is not limited to himself as a physical individual, but is in an active social relationship of modification of the cultural environment. End of quote, can class and gender struggle, so exploited by the benevolent harbingers of capital and clan, be sustained? Can vanguardism be persistently supplemented by a preparation for mature aesthetic education in the tertiary and post-tertiary, so that it informs the general culture of the citizen? This is part of the question that animates my work now for 25 years in the villages in my home state of West Bengal. It is, CNN regularly calls my country the largest democracy in the world. And in the lower reaches, in these rural areas, is the largest sector of the electorate. So that to an extent, a democracy depends on electoral education, supplementing vanguardism. We represent the vanguard. We don't represent the country. So this is Gramsci, this is Du Bois. This is really the question. Can this be sustained? Schiller tried to undo the double bind of mind and body by suggesting the Spieltrieb, as you know, the play drive, art as a balancing act that will save society. He has been chided by Paul de Man and others for making a mistake about Kant, and also for the equally pervasive mistake of psychologizing Kant. One might add that this last is so pervasive a misreading of Kant that an early deconstructive formula can be applied to it. The entire tradition of the translation of Kant from the 18th century on down into English, it psychologizes Kant into a Christian gentleman. It's amazing how different Kant is if you read him in German. So one can say, one might add that this last is so pervasive a misreading of Kant that an early deconstructive formula can be applied to it. There must be something in the text that allows for such psychologizing. No excuses, although one must mark the places in the texts where the possibility for such misreadings arises, and mark also how Kant himself deals with them. This is where Kant's ultimately mechanical intuition of the functioning subject comes into play. Our task is also psychologizing to an extent, repeating Schiller's mistake and transforming balance to an open series of double binds. Double binds, contradictory instructions coming at the same time. The nature of life. I mean, you have to make decisions and you reduce double binds to single binds, but because otherwise you can't decide. On the other hand, you know if you are a serious activist or a parent or a statesperson or a teacher or anything smart, you know that because all decisions ask to have these double binds reduced to single binds, things will change. And so you will have to rethink rather soon, which is why laws can be revised. Justice cannot be revised, but laws have to be revised. This is because of the nature of things, double bind. So our task is also psychologizing, repeating Schiller's mistake and transforming balance, which is chiasmus in Schiller, to an open series of double binds. Schiller, a non-philosopher, made the kind of mistake which a general reader of philosophy must necessarily make, turn the desire inscribed in philosophy into its fulfillment. This is a major mistake with Marxism. Turn the desire inscribed in philosophy into the possibility of its fulfillment. Schiller is unequivocal about resolving the double bind. I quote, "All the disputes about the concept of beauty which have ever prevailed in the world of philosophy, and to some extent still prevail today, have no other source than this. Either the investigation did not start with a sufficiently strict distinction, or it was not carried through to a pure and complete synthesis. The drive toward form and the drive toward matter," Schiller writes, "cancel each other out, and the will maintains perfect freedom between them." Schiller writes, "As soon as two opposing fundamental drives are active within him, both lose their compulsion, and in the opposition of two necessities gives rise to freedom." Wishful thinking of the European 18th century. And nowhere is his domestication disproved again and again and again by, if one looks at the history of the world. And nowhere in his domestication of Kant is his domestication of Kant more apparent than in the celebrated definition of the aesthetic. "If we are to call the condition of sensuous determination the physical," writes Schiller, "and the condition of rational determination with us logical or moral, then we must call this condition of real and active determinability the aesthetic." From here, it is no more than a step to an idealized account of education to which the tough effortfulness of a Gramsci or a Du Bois can bear no resemblance. I quote, "He must learn to desire more nobly," says Schiller. Yes, after this, as I was saying yesterday in our conversation, the collapsing of the commercial and the investment banks. I mean, certainly Goethe believed that the United States carried the promise of these European dreams. What kind of noble desire did we see in action? And you mentioned that nothing has been cut. Why are we being cut so badly? Because obviously this is false. He must learn to desire more nobly. So must learn is good, but no such learning can come in today's planning because of the cutting back of the humanities. He must learn, remember what I said, rearranging of desires. He must learn to desire more nobly. It's not a question of traveling and having foreign students and clicking on all kinds of remote places. That's not the agenda that globalization is calling for. He must learn to desire more nobly so that he may not need to will sublimely. This is brought about by means of aesthetic education, writes Schiller, which subjects to laws of beauty all those spheres of human behavior in which neither natural laws nor yet rational laws are binding upon human caprice, and which, in the form it gives to outer life, already opens up the inner. Yet, here and there, the aporetic intuition of the German 19th century, that is to say, the fact that you cannot cross over, of course, Heidegger is just going to completely deny this. Nietzsche's Zarathustra allows crossing over. But the romantic notion that you cannot cross over certain kinds of gaps sometimes does emerge when, for example, Schiller talks about the effort to make the aesthetic emerge as something, I quote, which might serve as a pledge in the sensible world of a morality as yet unseen. But, as the famous 11th letter shows, he thinks of the self as undivided, as something which can, I quote, annul time, or, quote, subjugate the manifold variety of the world to its own unity, unquote. Anybody who is as much an aficionado of Kant as I am, and I'm sure there are people in this room who feel about Kant as I do, anybody of that kind of stripe will see that the philosophical rigor of the unacknowledged, fractured Kantian subject, Kant doesn't agree, of course, as you well know, if you say to him, look at, one of the most powerful things about your philosophy is the fracturing of the subject. Say, what fracture? What subject? That's Kant's answer in his correspondence, right? But nonetheless, we have the right to read. The philosophical rigor of the unacknowledged, fractured Kantian subject is not to be found in Schiller. Kant himself has confidence in commerce as bringing peace without commenting on the inadequacy of the absence of violence in the interest of commerce as the ethical marker of a just society. It's very alarming in perpetual peace. Marx's mistake was to think that the workers' self-interest would decline if the secret of social productivity were revealed. Schiller knew better, but thought that the solution lay in ethical instruction. It was Gramsci's genius, once again, to understand that the point was to deconstruct Marx and epistemologize the project, instrumentalizing the new intellectual to produce the subaltern intellectual, so far invariably lost in the vanguardism of the immediate aftermath of revolutions. A disinterested episteme can allow and withstand the interruption of the ethical, Gramsci imagined. Study humanism, said Gramsci, in somewhat the same spirit as some of us say, deep language learning and literary textuality trains the ethical reflex. Trains, doesn't assure it. For lack of time, I cannot develop the difficult point that, for Kant, philosophizing is an intended mistake. This is an entire reading, so I can't do anything about it right here. Where the philosophizing is an intended mistake where intention is a drive. I mean, it's a Triebfeder. That's Kant's word. Not drive. Drive is Freud. Where intention is a drive. De Man notices that the Spieltrieb or play drive, being part of human programming, is, however remotely, related to Kant's can't help philosophizing because driven scenario. This is where the lever can be inserted to deconstruct Schiller from reversibility into double bind. I can go along with Hart and Negri. I don't have to give any more background in this audience, I'm sure, thinking about globalizing. I can go along with Hart and Negri when they speak of making the multitude, although for me, epistemological shifting is a preparation rather than a political organization. I can, however, never accept that the multitude authors itself, and I quote, in an uninterrupted process of collective self-transformation attendant upon digital idealism. This is Hart and Negri. This needs a reality check. The universities are not yet ready for burning. If there is an automatic authorship of the multitude, then we don't need ourselves. The humanities have not yet become useless in principle. Post-humanism has not been achieved. Godot will never arrive. We can only ever be on the way. A universe of productive linguistic networks, this is a phrase from them, must take into account that because of the immense linguistic richness of the world, we cannot always understand each other. You would never imagine this when you're reading Hart and Negri talking about linguistic richness. We cannot always understand each other, and some might want to preserve that mystery in the face of the data-based clarity of globalized capital. And the service sector, forever celebrated by the right, cannot just be given the new sexy name, as it has been by them, I quote, immaterial production. It is not enough to imply, as they do, that in biopolitics, ill-defined, if at all, in their 3 challenging books, the body is the mind. In an age of exponential genomic and neurological techno-research, it is no longer particularly radical to hold this position. Without the habits of democratic reflexes, I'm with them in their celebration of habit and multitude, there is no democracy. different kinds of context-specific aesthetic education as the long-term moving base of this in this variegated world of ours, forever not yet a globe, is something we have to think about. In other words, rethinking history as simultaneous rather than always having some kind of implicit idea that something called modernity must happen somewhere, and therefore legitimizing it by reversal, we must claim some kind of bogus, bad faith modernity when we actually choose that other thing which we think is teleological. Simultaneous streams of history is a very hard thing to think about. Some of us are beginning to try. It's not easy, and certainly books won't tell us how to do it. I was talking about this fantastic river project with Chandranagore and Senegambia. I wish I could really talk about that project rather than this, where we say as we write the project proposals, we are not quite sure how to think of this radiating globality. We are telling you what all we are going to do, a whole group of people, and we are hoping that as we do this, we are going to be able to say something about the method. It's not easy. In intellectual history of consciousness, people write about these kinds of things, and they always say that 100 years later, this kind of change happened, etc. So to an extent, we also have to think about the future anterior, that whatever we are doing now, something will have happened that people will think about later. So anyway, Samuel Eisenstadt's multiple modernities seems much more coherent with the contemporaneity of globalization, although it's a kind of earlier discursive mode. If the internet and the network society are taken as the allegory of reading the multitude, much is excluded. In the face of the dilemma of simultaneity, this is Klaus Offer's words, he counsels for Eastern Europe, and I quote, "Macro events have assumed an incredible speed," he writes. "Individual actors need patience in order not to interfere with the creative destruction," his words, "which will follow the price and property reform in a perfectly intended manner, although by making use of their newly won civil rights, they," the Eastern European countries, he writes, "would be quite capable of doing so." Charles Tilly says his reading tells him that a certain level of trust is a necessary condition of democracy. Patience, Offer. Trust, Tilly. Where are these virtues coming from? Who trains for these anymore? Yet the universities curb the humanities. If these conjectures are even roughly correct, Tilly writes, we have been tracing not just an interesting set of political transformations, his last book on democracy, but a path to the enhancement of human capability and welfare and aesthetic education. On the level of the loosely held assumptions and presuppositions which English-speaking peoples have been calling culture for 200 years, change is incessant. But as they change, these unwitting presuppositions become belief systems, organized suppositions. Rituals coalesce to match, support, and advance beliefs and suppositions. But these presuppositions also give us the wherewithal to change our world, to innovate and create. Most people believe, even or perhaps particularly when they're being cultural relativists, that creation and innovation is their own cultural secret, whereas others are only determined by their cultures. This is something that one hears every day, all the time, in intellectual discussions, on television, everywhere. This habit is unavoidable and computed with the help of sexual difference, sustained into something feminists who are speakers of English started calling gender in the last 40 years also. But if we aspire to be citizens of the world, we must not only fight the habit of thinking creation and innovation is our own cultural secret, we must also shake the habit of thinking that our version of computing gender is the world's and simply ignore it unless we are specifically speaking of women and queers. Though, as an instrument of abstraction, gender is in fact a position without identity, it is sexualized in cultural practice. You cannot, although gender is an instrument of abstraction and has been for long, long before globality could even be thought about, since there was such a thing as social formations, nonetheless, it cannot be thought of only abstractly. It has to be sexualized in cultural practice. We can therefore never think of this abstracting instrumentality of gender fully with this two-sentence introduction, I will go to the conclusion of Demann's Kant and Schiller. Demann singles out a passage in Schiller that engenders the aesthetic and leaves it deadpan. Allow me a longish quotation. Actually, in the book, the quotation is much longer. I've shortened it. The other sex, Schiller says, this is Demann, the other sex, Schiller says, the female sex, can and should not share scientific knowledge with man, but by ways of its figural representation, it can share the truth with him. Taste, and this is a very big word, it's not our word. Those of you who study British Romanticism will know that Wordsworth and company, they thought they were educating public taste, by which they mean something like rearranging desires and so on and so forth. Taste includes or hides the natural intellectual difference between the two sexes, Schiller writes. It nourishes and embellishes the feminine mind with the products of the masculine mind and allows the beautiful sex to feel what it has not thought and to enjoy what it has not produced by its labor. End of the Schiller quote. Demann continues, that much for women. At any rate, this is Demann, the theoretical conclusion, just as the sensory becomes without tension a metaphor for reason, writes Demann, in Schiller, women become without oppression a metaphor for men. Because the relation of woman to man is that of the metaphor to what it indicates, still Demann, or that of the sensory representation to reason, Schiller's considerations on education lead to a concept of art as the metaphor or popularization of philosophy. Philosophy, as you saw, is the domain of men. Art is basically, the beautiful is the domain of women. The relationship is that of the metaphor. This is the end of Demann's, a much longer passage. I have no interest in renewing or rescuing either Schiller or Demann into good gender politics, whatever that might be. It is not a secret, Said writes about this, that feminization is a put-down, alas. Yet the aesthetic for Schiller is a powerful thing, fit for princes, which can save the world from itself. It cannot be denied that these peculiar deployments of woman is the moment of transgression which beckons to be undone, and I hope to do so. And many of you will remember Herder's criticism of Kant's stuff on the Enlightenment and so on. This is a curious passage. In the early days of academic feminism, we distinguished between male tasks and domestic, female and servant tasks as one time only and repeated because forever necessary, respectively. One time only and repeated. Footnotes and cooking. Something you can footnote as opposed to cooking and cleaning, let us say. Schiller's woman is upper class at first glance. If, however, you look closely at the passage Demann quotes, you will see that the distinction between access to truth and access to figuration is a displacement of the distinction between one time and repetition. And you remember that Demann will go toward the Schlegels and he'll talk about parabasis, right? But that's not where I'm going, because I think that's not the model. The distinction between one time and repetition that we discussed as historically assigned to male and classed female. One can add this concept metaphor of female to think the place of the aesthetic, to shore up a world gone awry by rational choice, misrepresenting the abstract rationality of the electronic, empiricizing the imagination into reasonable programming, even as the imagination as event inevitably escapes. I borrow this name, female, as Foucault borrows the name power. It's a nominalist gesture. Because it has a great deal of historical weight, it's easy to understand, still easy to understand. And it is even easy to understand if you go outside of the university into the world, perhaps particularly easy to understand when you go into the world, because I live in the world a great deal, rather more than most academics. This is how Gramsci's shorthand phrase, humanist history, can be expanded in today's context. And this is how we must instrumentalize ourselves as new intellectuals in the hope of a good world in the aporetic mode of to come. I say this with some degree of hopelessness because life and hope are too easily claimed by the camp of mere reason. Mere reason, that's also Kant, mere reason, the fourth critique. which Kant calls morally lazy, I quote. It would be more appropriate to end with an impossible, quote, female task in Schiller's sense and mine. Let me end with the invocation of such a task in the conclusion of Jacques Derrida's Rogue, or Voyou. It is not a thankless task, but a gendered task, a necessary repetition of difference rather than the one-time-only securing of good theory, where gender is a position. You see, genitalist stuff gets completely messed up here. Martha Nussbaum, who is, of course, recognizably by secondary sexual characteristics and so on, a woman. But nonetheless, she's more interested here. So I'm not, in fact, a genitalist, just as in the case of racism, I'm not a chromatist. The one-time only securing of good theory where gender is a position without identity. Schiller's injunction to feminize the aesthetic, the last best gift to me, a woman, his first PhD, bequeathed against the grain by my disgraced teacher, Paul de Man. Here is the task in Derrida in the persistent and repetitive mode of women and servants' work. I quote, "It remains," Derrida writes, "to be known how to translate, for example, the word reasonable, and how to pay one's respects to, bow to, how to greet beyond its Latinity and in more than one language, the fragile difference between the rational and the reasonable, and I would say the absolute untranslatability of the word culture unless you're just looking for synonyms of the European word." This is I'm adding to what Derrida is writing about. To acknowledge that linguistic diversity alone can curb the global, must acknowledge that comparative literature programs, including the two founded by René Vellec and Northrop Frye, are in danger of extinction today. In the ferocious thrust to be, quote, global, the humanities and the qualitative social sciences, quote, comparative at their best, are no longer a moving epistemological force. They are seen to be like the opera, although not matched in fundable glamour, serving a peripheral function in society, which certainly society cannot hope to match in any particular way. And already it is the relatively glamorous think tanks and monolingual, quote, interdisciplinarity, rather than the curricular humanities and social sciences that are gaining funding. US core curricula, minimally politically correct by including multicultural classics, again in English, translation, are traveling internationally. And I'm also on those committees. When you have taught for as long as I have, 46th year of full-time teaching, and you happen to be another color skin, although you are a Europeanist, and you happen to be female, you're an ethnocultural agenda and you're on these terrifying committees. But at any rate, so core curricula, minimally politically correct by including multicultural classics, again in English translation, are traveling internationally. It is ironic that China, with its bi-millennial tradition of imperial civil service core curricula, is a top candidate on this list. Muscular Marxists are giving way to the corporate-funded feudality of the digitally confident alter globalists. Deep language learning and unconditional ethics are so out of joint with this immensely powerful Brave New World machine that people of our sort make this plea because we cannot do otherwise. Yet our shared obsession is obliged to declare that some hope of bringing about the epistemological revolution needed to turn capital around to gendered social justice again and again must still be kept alive against all hope. In the preface to Allegories of Reading, de Man describes a shift, I quote, not an end, a shift, he says, this is him, from historical definition to the problematics of reading, typical of my generation, he writes, most interested in its results than in its causes, end of quote. Careful words, shifting a generation born in Europe in the 20s away from historical definition to a problematics of reading. My generation was born when de Man's generation was flirting with fascism. We came of age outside of Europe when their war, where we fought for our masters, inaugurated the end of territorial imperialism. I am now a good deal older than de Man was when he died. Typical of my generation, as he writes, is this concern for preserving the dreams of post-coloniality, as I would write, in the face of globalization, although it's no longer a good way of studying the demands of the global. De Man goes on to say that the shift from history to reading, typical of his generation, I quote, could in principle lead to a rhetoric of reading reaching beyond the canonical principles of literary history, reaching beyond, displaced to another place. How far beyond? As far as I pull in these times, altogether elsewhere, into a global aesthetic work that cannot simply sacrifice the wealth of the world's languages? If the importance of first language acquisition as activating the metapsychological circuits of ethical semiosis is grasped, we will understand that globalization itself is the site of a double bind. If everybody is learning Chinese and English, they're not learning it in that other way, where the metapsychological circuits are activated into the making of ethical semiosis, only first language learning. So you can't just go that other route. We will understand that globalization itself is the site of a double bind, and the task of the humanities is to attempt to supplement it. Even a good globalization, the failed dream of socialism, requires the uniformity which the diversity of mother tongues must challenge. The Tower of Babel is our refuge. In that spirit, I perform the task of a translator and read a few clips from Sthaniyo Sangbad by Moinak Bishas, a first film by an independent filmmaker. Now, all the clips have moved into different areas, but I time budgeted so that this is not too long as a talk, okay? So you must give me the time to look for the clips as they've moved here and there. That it is a move from post-colonial to global, the ingenious film reader can perhaps work out as follows. I'm suggesting that without an aesthetic education into nuance, this is very broad for you, but how much can you work out? You can perhaps work out that it is a move from post-colonial to global. Now let me find number, there we go. It's got two here. The first one is simply, it's kind of pale. Should we perhaps turn down some lights? You're never going to see anything otherwise. This one especially, it's like it's a sort of vertical picture of the actual neighborhood. It'll come slowly. See, it's coming up. I think he's imitating Bamako. But he's not like a mature filmmaker, but this is his first try. And that's why it's teachable. So it says, I've quite advisedly not kept the subtitles. It says, Kolkata Dokhin Pranto, the south edge of Calcutta. দেশভাগের পরে বাস্তু মানুষ এখানে এসে উপনিবেশ তৈরি করেন. After the partition of the country, refugees came here and established colonies. And the first one says, this says Colony Pada, the neighborhood of the refugee colony. Okay, now there should be another one here. This thing actually had not just one, but two. Let me see. There we go. Beautiful. This is where you will find the business of refugees, because there are some English words. They are talking about who has been, these are the neighborhood boys. They're talking about who has been here longest. And someone says, my family came 70 years ago. Tank. How long have you seen this neighborhood? Our family came 70 years ago. And he says, us you are refugees. But so, if you're looking at this and the word refugee is there and so on, you understand that this is about post-colonial, okay? But that's about it. The partition of India was coeval with independence 63 years ago. 70 years, when the guy says we came 70 years ago, it means solidly pre-refugee. Yesterday, Rain was telling local jokes with accent variations. People were laughing. I couldn't understand them, of course. And many of you in the, that's the whole thing, right? I mean, that's what I'm talking about in terms of aesthetic education and languages, to understand globality. And many of you in the audience can perhaps tell Brooklynese from the accent of New York's Upper West Side or Cockney from Oxbridge. Given the linguistic priorities of globalization, it is only with a focused aesthetic education that you will grasp the effort in the film to set apart the accent of Eastern Bengal, East Pakistan at independence, now Bangladesh, from the regular accent of Southern Kolkata. Now let's see if you can, actually, there we go. See, this accent is very, very different. These are the older refugees. Fire everywhere at the time of partition. Nobody lived here. There were some Muslim peasants. And you see the new generation coming in. This is the repetitive persistence of women's servant-style aesthetic education, as in Derrida's Auslegung of what for me spells Sabotaging Schiller. It is never global. It's not local. It supplements globality. This is a story of postcolonial to global. The stories cannot be told in other ways. There's glocal and so on, space rather than place. These are alibis. They're not talking about the humanities. And yesterday I was saying to a geographer something about the spectralization of the rural. That's another argument, but that's also something we have to think about. It is never global. It supplements globality, restores a world where ethical semiosis is possible. If that was postcolonial, here is global. Now let's see if I can get this. Here is global. I think this, yes, You'll recognize this. I'll cut it off. And these are hoods, small-time crooks. This is a businessman. He's talking about huge responsibility. Green chemical, purple ash. হারানো গ্রামকে খুঁজে বার করতে হবে. We have to find again our lost village. It's that global village argument, McLuhan and Lyotard, that we were talking about. And then he'll talk about education. This is the crook. Did we get the third prize? And when he talks about education, he'll say, Adhunik Shikha Puratan Sanskar. Sanskar, that word for Sanskrit that, Rain, you and I were talking about. Modern educational methods, old traditions. That's what he'll say, and then I'll cut it off. I will move a continent from one side to the other by getting soil up. New houses. There'll be trees, birds. There will be lotus flowers in the little ponds. Shikha Pratishthan, educational institutions. Adhunik Shikha, modern educational method. Puratan Sanskar, old traditions, globalization. Now, this is the true culturalist face of globality, an absurd version of Amartya Sen, whose names some in the audience will know. Haranogram khunje pete hobe, we must find our lost villages. Adhunik shikha, modern educational systems, puratan sanskar, old traditions. Crucial details will escape you, but not our model of an aesthetic education that sees globality both as collective and an island of languaging in a field of traces. Now this thing, don't fall, okay. An island of, this is a good part. I always wonder why people leave at certain points. I used to discuss it with my mother, but mother died. But at any rate, I've already noticed an island of languaging in a field of traces. I wrote this in a catalogue essay on a huge piece of sculpture that Anish Kapoor did for the permanent collection of the German Guggenheim. The island of languaging, this is what globalization is in a field of traces. A sign system promises meaning, that's languaging. A trace does not promise anything. It is something that seems to suggest that there was something before, spur. In the presence of the world's richness of languages, an aesthetic education is guided by traces of traces. The young poet figure in the film sees the colonial and post-colonial flows in the city as two separate countries. The global undoes the divide and promises jobs to both the two aspiring crooks we see in the previous clip and the aspiring poet whom we will see in a later clip. The figure that acts as pivot or lever in the filmic text is Rabindranath Tagore, whose name certainly the older figures in this room will know, maybe the younger also. Rabindranath Tagore. Just as I had no way of relating Day Before Yesterday to a discussion of the Estonian novel where literature becomes psychological evidence, or accessing George Schöpflin's experience of post-war Europe or Glasgow, so also you cannot understand this levering or pivoting that operates the post-colonial turn to global agency without the attention to nuance of an aesthetic education. Globally, and this is across the board, not just Tagore, globally, rightly or wrongly, Tagore is most often a liberatory figure of nationalist resistance. One can do this with Gandhi as well in another way. Tagore is most often a liberatory figure of nationalist resistance. In Hong Kong, my friend and colleague Fred Chio made an impassioned statement of identity with India, especially invoking Rabindranath Tagore. Such statement, if I can tell you a joke, is the terrifying son of Yeats, when I met him, told me that Yeats was once rowing in Cool Lake. I mean, he's really, rowing in Cool Lake and muttering to himself, and when he came close enough, he heard that Yeats was saying Rabindranath Tagore, but that doesn't fit into my argument. It just shows the decrepitude of Yeats's son's cultural sense. But at any rate, so globally, rightly or wrongly, Tagore is most often a liberatory figure of nationalist resistance. In Hong Kong, my friend and colleague Fred Chio made an impassioned statement of identity with India, especially invoking the poet Rabindranath Tagore. Such statements of solidarity go a long way toward undoing exclusivist regionalisms. They can connect with the sort of exoticized solidarity that is available in the everyday practice of enlightened tourism. But just as such everyday gestures of solidarity melt in the face of economic competition or military or political mobilization, so do gestures such as Chio's remain discontinuous with or disconnected from his actual politics, if not amended by his counterpart, such as myself, from the other place. Tagore was indeed altogether unusual in wanting to claim, quote, Asia, perhaps the world, rather than India as his home. We must honor that initiative, especially today. But because the vicissitudes of such initiatives did not allow the practical struggle to destroy the mechanisms of class apartheid at home to flourish, Tagore's admirable efforts eventually worked for its consolidation. Today, the divide between the Bolpur, the railway station serving Tagore's university, Shiuri, Rajnagar, Ranigram, Shahabad trajectory, to name only one of the many possible ones, and the Kolkata-leaning trajectory of the university itself is relatively inflexible below the upper middle-class line. It reminds me, Bruce, of Atlanta's status as a Sunbelt metropolis, its lines to immediately adjacent rural North Georgia, relatively feeble. I used to teach at Emory. What lies on the other side of this line is the largest sector of the potential electorate. In this film, we see Tagore's middle-class accessible lyrics creating a culturalist middle class, and this has been going on for many, many decades. In the early 20th century, the Bengali colonial subject Loken Palit had famously said about Tagore, I quote, "He's at once Shelley and Wordsworth," end of quote. Here, this is a Bengali guy, here the filmmaker presents with loving irony the Bengali Tagore, not Shelley and Wordsworth, helping class mobility and undoing the boy-girl divide. Here they are. This is a nice clip. There we go. Look at. These are young women from, this is very common. They're all practicing Tagore songs for a spring festival. And this guy is the poet figure, the young poet. This is really extraordinarily romantic kind of nonsensical stuff. Again, the message of new blossoms has come. And the girls are laughing, as you can see, smiling. See, Shandesh means news, but it also means a certain kind of sweet that you eat. So, almari, you know, this Portuguese origin word, armoire. So, okay, and now you see how it also undoes the boy-girl divide. If I can find it, you will see it. Ta-da. Yeah, there we go. See that. Those boys again, they're talking. It's night. No, not this, not this one. Oh, after the boys singing. Where's the boys singing? I can't find the boys singing. Isn't that sad? Well, you're not going to hear it. That's where the... sorry?
In the upper row.
There's a boy singing? Fourth from the left? 1, 2, 3, 4? Ah, yes, it doesn't look like the thanks, whoever you are. Yes, there we go. Where there's a murder, what did you say? He sang that song that they were singing. So the guy sings the whole thing. Okay, so this, as you can see, this kind of neutralizing the problem of the sexes, the young girls and the young boys, through this kind of use of Tagore, and then finally it also undoes the local-global divide in the language that travels, and I read some of that, all the way to that inspired public relations dream, an African woman's or girl child's face with the logo, "I'm powerful," available to all in English as Globalization's trademark. That clip, the earlier Globalization clip, where he's talking about education, and at the end, the two crooks are talking about, we don't want to study communication, we want to do media studies. You won't get it without an aesthetic education, that this is, in fact, that kind of traveling language of globality, which is also within the Tagore discourse. Ben Baer has brilliantly connected this mindset with Raymond Williams's depiction of the Bloomsbury fraction in the British context. In conclusion, then, I repeat, the humanities should recognize that their strength is their perceived weakness from the existentially impoverished globalizers.